Should the disgraced newsreader Huw Edwards return his salary to the Beeb? And then I'm adding the caveat, would you? As the BBC's highest paid news presenter, Edwards was on a salary of almost £500,000, so recouping the money from the time of his arrest last year before he resigned in April might go some way to restoring faith in the corporation's handling of one of its biggest and now entirely disgraced stars. But in writing to Edwards to ask him to return the money, the BBC appears to be relying on him to do the right thing. In light of what we know about his past behaviour, how realistic is that position? Now, I should tell you, by the way, folks, that those aren't my words. Okay, I just read them out from a BBC News article online earlier under the headline, "Is the BBC realistic to ask for Huw Edwards to return his pay?" The BBC asking questions of the BBC. The left hand of the BBC questioning what the right hand of the BBC is doing online. That's what I pay my licence fee for, damn it. Gosh. Now, in case you've just come back from a holiday in, I know, Timbuktu, Edwards, the BBC's highest profile newsreader, had a fairly revolting private life and was exposed as a pervert in a newspaper sting. Last month, he pleaded guilty to child porn charges. But from the time of his expose in The Sun last spring to a date slightly earlier than his court case, the BBC decided to continue paying him his full wage, including 5 months after his arrest. In a letter to staff, the BBC chair, Samir Shah, said Edwards had behaved in bad faith. God, you don't say. Edwards pleaded guilty to an appalling crime. Shah continued, had he been up front when asked by the BBC about his arrest, we would never have continued to pay him public money. The board says Edwards has undermined trust in the BBC and brought us into disrepute. It calls him the villain of the piece. Strong words, but the board is firmly backing the decisions by its Director General and other executives last year to continue to pay Edwards after his arrest. Oh. He would have received, we believe, around £200,000 of licence fee payers' money over the 5 months after the BBC knew he'd been arrested and before he was given the space to resign. Now, of course, we believe someone is innocent until proven guilty in this country. The principle underlines the rule of law, and so I think there is an argument that the BBC did have a duty of care to their star. That would certainly justify paying Edwards from the time of the expose in The Sun to his arrest and even after, though I'm not sure I would have given him the £40,000 pay rise he landed last year as well. According to the BBC's own online report, and I'm quoting, it's also instructive that the chair, Samir Shah, who took up his post in March, has said he's exercised by the ongoing issue of how the BBC handles bad behaviour by those with power within the organisation. Again, you don't say. The article then tells us how there have already been 2 internal investigations into Huw Edwards. One was into the original allegations made by The Sun that he paid a teenager for explicit photographs. And after that, there was another confidential disciplinary process into his behaviour towards colleagues. Neither has been published in any form which doesn't exactly instill confidence. But the question we must wrestle with today is whether Edwards should return his salary. It strikes me just asking him to might be a salve for the conscience of many, if not all, on the board of the Beeb, even if it doesn't win 1 penny back. Will Edwards listen while waiting to hear his sentence next month? Will he open his bank account, dig deep and do the right thing? Should he? And right by who? The BBC, the victims in those photos, or you and me, the licence fee payers? See, faced with the prospect of never working again in broadcasting, although I guess there's always the sewer of misinformation that's GB News, and never say never, Huw, he might want to keep hold of his ill-gotten gains. You tend to get a large tax bill just as the big checks stop in this business, so he'll have to prepare for that. But then again, what price redemption? For what Huw did, I'd like to think it's slightly more than 200 grand. In a moment, I hear your thoughts. Should he repay the money? Is the BBC right to ask him to when few colleagues believe that Edwards will comply? And I will be asking all of you who call in if you would repay the money if you were stuck in the same high-class shoes as Huw. But first, though, I'm joined by a man who knows more about the media's machinations than most. That's Michael Cole, former BBC correspondent. Good morning to you, Michael.
Good morning, Matthew. If Huw Edwards has a shred of decency left, and I admit it's a big if he has a shred of decency, he will immediately repay that money and send with it an apology to his former colleagues at the BBC who do a good job and have been as disgusted as most of us have been by this regrettable, appalling, disgusting episode. And the BBC then should immediately give that money to the NSPCC, which does wonderful work protecting children against people like Huw Edwards. Because, as you brilliantly outlined, this is a long and tortuous story. But let's go back to November. Last year, the Director General and the head of news both knew that Edwards had been arrested. The rest of the BBC did not know that, but they did. And they would have been entitled to ask him, is there any truth in these allegations, Huw? Because he, as a chapel-going family man, as he's advertised himself quite widely as that, if he gave an honest answer, and we know that he's pleaded guilty to 3 very serious charges, if he'd said, yes, there is truth in it, he would quite clearly have been in breach of the clause in his contract, which would have said you must do, he must have agreed to do and never do or say anything that would have brought the BBC into disrepute. On that, they would have been entirely entitled to discontinue his contract, to sack him. Instead of that, they employed him, and as you've noted, gave him a rise. And he carried on working, well, not working, because he hasn't been in the studio for months. He was ill and so on and so forth. But they didn't even sack him at the end. He was allowed, even after he'd been charged, to resign. Now, that was a mistake. The handling of this by the BBC has been very abject, and that's witnessed the fact that Samir Shah is saying we've got to look at the way we handle things.
I said I'm going to ask everybody. You said straight away with the caveat, if he was to do the right thing. Would you do it if you were in? I'm not saying the same charges, but if you found yourself, out of work, where let's say you've been suspended on full pay and it doesn't go your way and you're out, and then the company says they want the money back, would you send the money back? Would you not think about your family, your own sense of personal security, regardless of any sort of moral or legal outrage? You self-preservation kicks in. He's never going to work again.
Yeah, Matthew, I'll give you an honest answer about that. I think it's wrong, even I might say sinful, to be paid for work you haven't done. I've always felt that from the very beginning. I really have. Unless you do the job, you don't deserve the pay. That may be old-fashioned, but that's the way I believe.
But let's say you were paid. Would you send the money back?
Well, if I hadn't done the job, if I had not been working, and this man has not been working for goodness knows how long, he immediately went into sick leave and went into some care place where he's been more or less ever since. Of course, I would send the money back if I were culpable in that way, or if I hadn't done the job, because we've all got personal responsibility. That's what being alive is all about, taking responsibility for our actions. Actions have consequences. And this, I think, would be the very least. If he is at all contrite, if he actually has a conscience, if he actually considers what he's done and what he's admitted he's done, then I think that's the very least he could do to try and make amends and move on with his life. And that's the only way, really, I
love the way you say that this is what life is about, taking responsibility. And that is a huge statement. And it's one I'd like to think, I concur. Thank you, Michael. Follow that, Darren Newman, employment lawyer. In fact, no, before I ask you to follow that, Darren, let's talk about the BBC and its actions. I don't think anybody here is querying or questioning his suspension on full pay until the BBC became aware of his arrest. There does seem to be, for many of us, the moment of arrest and the BBC's awareness, or certain members of the BBC's awareness of his arrest, does seem to be the pivotal moment over which the argument of his pay hangs. Would you agree with that?
I'd certainly agree that the arrest changed things for the BBC. That made it a different situation. Prior to then, we had allegations about his personal conduct. It's not clear that they were directly connected to his work. They weren't being treated as a police matter. So, and he was off sick as well, and quite possibly hospitalised as well. So that makes it difficult to deal with. Certainly being arrested changes things. An employer is entitled to say, well, now that you've been arrested for something, we can look into this and see whether there's realistically a way back for you, and whether the situation you're in is so irredeemable that it's not realistic for you to come back. But that is something that takes time. You don't just automatically get to dismiss anyone who gets arrested. People get arrested and not charged.
Yes.
And he wasn't charged until several months later. Could the employer show that he'd committed a breach of contract that would have allowed him to be dismissed without notice? Because I think the key thing with Huw Edwards, rather than thinking about unfair dismissal, which is quite a low compensation claim, the thing about Huw Edwards is his notice pay. And what level of notice was he on? So that if they just decided to terminate his contract and they gave him his notice, well, where would that have paid him up till? How much notice do we think he was on? 6 months, a year? I mean, what happened here was he was arrested in November, and by April, he's left the organisation with no further payments being made. I think most public sector employers would regard that as handling things pretty quickly. That's not actually
point taken, Darren.
That's not actually a bad deal for the BBC.
Okay,
if they dismissed him on the day in November, they could have been paying him till June.
Okay, I'll take that on board. The £40,000 pay rise, is there any way the BBC could have legally avoided giving him a pay bump, such a significant boost in the middle of all of this?
I don't think so. If it was a general pay rise, I mean, it sounds like a lot. It sounds like a lot because he was on a lot of money to start with. And I think a lot of the debate around this has been throwing around figures like 200,000 and 40,000, which are more to do with the fact of here is someone who's paid an eye-wateringly high salary. And so it all sounds like very large sums of money. But if it was just a normal pay rise that was given to anybody, why would you withhold it from someone when you haven't demonstrated they're in breach of contract?
Is the BBC... In a professional opinion, is the BBC right or wrong to even ask for his money back?
Well, there's no harm in asking. They might get the money back. If you don't ask, you don't get. I can't see what the legal claim would be to get it back, unless there's something very specific in his contract that says not only you won't bring us into disrepute, but you will immediately confess to anything you've done that brings us into disrepute. Okay. I've never seen that in a contract. So it would be breaking new legal ground. It would be very exciting if they brought a claim. I almost wish that they would, just to see how it plays out. But I don't see how there's a legal claim to get his money back.
So this sort of underlines my belief that this is a sort of salve for the conscience of the board of the BBC, that we asked for him to give the money back. Now, before I let you go, the ultimate question, I suppose, Darren, is if you were in his position, you've been paid, you've been sacked, or resigned rather, actually being given space to resign. Your former employer wants the money back. We're not going to talk about any charges or anything like that. Would you feel any moral obligation? One, would you feel a moral obligation to return the money? And two, would you return the money?
I think, to be honest, if my employer had continued paying me salary until I'd resigned, and I thought I'd saved them a fair bit of trouble by resigning, I don't think I would necessarily feel under a moral obligation to pay it back. That was my salary. I was contractually engaged. It would obviously depend on the precise circumstances, whether I felt morally stirred by what had happened. But I like to think I wouldn't find myself in Huw Edwards' position.
Likewise. Darren Newman, pleasure talking to you this Saturday morning. A difficult conversation, but it's interesting that Darren, I think, was echoing my view that at the end of the day, this story is really about making the board of the BBC feel better about itself. And I just wonder how that makes you feel, dear listener.